So there's a whole class of multiples or ratios that we can think of as enterprise value ratios. And they literally are the firm's enterprise value divided by some cash flow variant. It might be free cash flow, it might be EBIT, it might be EBITDA, it might be no plat, but typically they're a cash flow variable of some kind. Now you're going to see within the material that I have linked for you on Canvas that there is also a part or a subset of the enterprise value multiples that have nothing to do with the cash flow. Perhaps it's the number of units, or perhaps it's a tax, or it's a number of employees, or something that has nothing to do with the cash flows. I've got that material in Canvas for you because you're going to find that material in virtually any finance textbook that talks about this, but we're only going to focus on the enterprise value multiples that have some connection to cash flows. Those would be EV sales or EV revenue, same thing, EV EBITDA, EV EBIT, and EV free cash flow. We recognize that sales or revenue, EBITDA, EBIT, are all three components that lead into free cash flow itself, right? So these are enterprise value multiples, and what they're telling us is the company's enterprise value as a ratio of whatever we have in the denominator. And this is a very simplistic and very commonly used valuation construction. You guys have seen Shark Tank. We've talked about Shark Tank in class before, and they often talk about multiples. You know, something times earnings, something times revenue. Those are enterprise value multiples. Megan?
Okay, so how do you do this for a startup company that has negative EBITDA, or would you use a different model?
Great question. I would use a different model.
Okay, because they're using like and I'm asking about this case study that I was looking at, and they are projecting cash flows in the future, but it's all based off of assumptions. And currently they have negative EBITDA, but I'm assuming that their value is not negative.
I think that would be a reasonable assumption. So let's consider, let's consider Tesla during most of its experience. Bigger than a bread box in terms of its worth, right? In fact, I believe it's still the most highly valued auto manufacturer on the planet. If not, it's close. For a while it was. Well, it was the most highly valued firm for auto manufacture when it was losing money. So clearly it couldn't be using a positive numerator and a negative denominator to come up with that value, right? It would have given us a negative outcome if we'd have done that, because the rules of math still apply within this rarefied finance environment. So that would suggest then that using, say, an EV-EBIT multiple, otherwise referred to just as an EBIT multiple, wouldn't be the right multiple to use. So you'll find that different companies in different stages of their progression in different industries warrant the use of different multiples. We're not going to spend much time in this class talking about that. If we were in Finance 409 or the more advanced version of this you might choose to participate in the future, we go into a lot more detail there, but not in this one. Here I'm just trying to get you to understand the utility of this. But these four multiples are the most commonly used forms of an enterprise value multiple when we're thinking about valuation. But they're just two numbers that are juxtaposed to each other, in this case in a quotient, that end up in a ratio, right? And we know that we can take the enterprise value, in this case divided by EBIT, and it gives us some number. Well, this is a ratio. It's not a valuation model, is it? But we can rearrange it and use it as a valuation model. We can rearrange it to estimate enterprise value. Let's assume for a moment that we knew the company's EBIT, which is easily known. We can either look at it on the income statement or we can forecast it, because we know how to forecast now. And we knew the multiple that the company should be using. Well, we multiply those two together and that gives us the estimated enterprise value. It's as simple as that. And it's as problematic as that. Think about this. Which would you prefer? Using one of these honkin' equations to come up with a valuation, or using a very simplistic model to come up with a valuation? Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out which one we'd rather have. Megan?
And can you Google like multiples per industry, like around what they're supposed to be?
You can. In fact, on Canvas, and I'll show you this in a few minutes, don't let me go leave today without going to Canvas and showing you. I've linked a bunch of this for you in Canvas already. I don't expect you to necessarily use it, but it's there to the extent you want to delve into this more deeply, to the extent you're interested. So, in fact, let's just go there right now so I don't forget. I'm going to the homepage, and then I'm going to course resources, which is one of our models or modules. And you'll see here I've got a number of different resources that we haven't really spent any time with. I've got some information from the valuation project. I've got some information from the power of multiples, which were 2 student research projects I did. If you've not been to these websites, you should go there, especially as we now are entering the interpretation phase of our class, because there's a tremendous amount of very rich information in these sites. But I've also linked for you the Mergent Intellect company data. I've linked for you something called the BVR or BV resources subscriptions. If you go to either one of these, and there's yet more that I've linked in other places, you'll see repositories of data that will help us identify by industry and sometimes by transaction what a multiple could, would, or should be for a company. Let me go back to the PowerPoint, and I'm going to relate this to something that you guys already have a better sense of. Let's assume for a minute that I've got my house here in Sandy, Utah, and I decide that I want to sell my house. How am I going to determine approximately what I should sell it for?
By looking at the market around,
looking at the market,
like
yeah.
similar houses or like similar sales that already happened.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in this case, similar very often means the similar lot size or similar number of bedrooms or similar square footage. Maybe there's some, maybe it's adjusted for this age difference, or maybe it gets adjusted because there's a different number of bathrooms. So if I've got a 4-bedroom house, that's 3,400 square feet, and if the 4-bedroom house next door is 3,800 square feet, we would expect the house next door to sell for more than my 4-bedroom house at 3,400 square feet, right? Assuming everything else was equal. Well, these are referred to as comparable values. And you can take and look at the price of a house divided by the number of bedrooms, and you get a ratio, right? You can take the price of a house divided by the number of square feet, and you can get a ratio. Those are valuation ratios. Those are real estate value multiples, and they're all on comparable terms. So if we want to identify the appropriate multiple for our company, we would look into the market, and we might look at other companies that have transacted where we've had buyers and sellers meet at a given price, so we know a number. We're not guessing anymore. If the check cleared the bank, it's real, right? And we can then take a look and see at what multiple did that sell at. If we know what the price was, the price is the enterprise value, right? And if we know what, let's say its EBIT was, we can come up with its enterprise value EBIT multiple of M. And let's say that was 7. Doesn't matter what the number is, it just gives us a number. But now if we know what that number is based upon comparables in the market around us, we can take that multiple, multiply it by our cash flow variable that was used in that multiple that we're comparing ourselves with, and we'll come up with an enterprise value. That is no different than a realtor is going to do when they come to your home and say, hey, you know, we're looking at your house. We think you should ask $700,000 for this house because in this area, you know, with the number of bedrooms you have, the number of square footage you've got, the acreage you've got, given the multiples and averaging those values, making some adjustments, it's giving us this number. It's the exact same process, just looking at a different set of numbers and a different repository to find comparables. So that's one of the ways that we could do this. What might be another way? Do we ever know what the value of our company is? We can estimate it, right?
Yeah.
We can look sometimes if we've got estimated values for equity and debt. We can look at the balance sheet information and we can come up with an enterprise value, can't we? You've been doing so for the last couple of months. Well, if I know the enterprise value and I know the EBIT, I can calculate a multiple. In fact, you might remember in the financial statement for Farm Hill, you did that. On the very far right-hand side, towards the bottom, you calculated the enterprise value and then you calculated the EV/EBIT multiple. Let me show you this for Maridravana really quickly so you remember where it's at.
It's 1276.
For Maridravana?
No, Farm Hill Group.
For Farm Hill, yeah. And I've got Farm Hill up here as well. And right there at 1276. So you guys have already done this. You just didn't know why you were doing it when I had you do it. And here for Maridravana, I come with the same calculation, and it gave me 9.28. So we can use comparables in the market, or we actually can use maybe our history of our own company, right? If I know that my enterprise value is X at some point, and my EBIT at that same moment was Y, well, X divided by Y gives me a number. If my company's attained that number in the past, is it reasonable that we could attain it in the future? Victor?
Yeah, so I had a question about the multiples that don't some, for instance, some analysts use these multiples to evaluate what the firm, so to say, what an investor should pay for.
Well, you see,
these kind of multiples to do that.
So I think you might be referring to a price-earnings multiple, price-earnings ratio. Now, it looks like we made just a lot. No, he's still there. I thought we lost you for a second there, Victor. So it's common for a stock or an equity investor to use a price-earnings multiple. That is a valuation multiple, but it's unique to common stock. And we're not going to use a price-earnings multiple for the entire company. But think about price divided by earnings. That's price-earnings multiple. Well, what if price was value of the whole company and earnings were the company's free cash flow? We could then come up with a number. That number would be M. It would be whatever it is. In this case, I'm using the value of the company divided by its EBIT, and I come up with a multiple, just a number. In this case, it's a historical number, and maybe I've got this number for every year for the last 10, 15 years or 5 years. I might average them out, or maybe I don't have that. I'm looking at other companies in the market through different repositories of data. I might use that. Or what if I know that another company out there, Aaron Enterprises, one of the best run, most profitable recreation management companies in the marketplace. Here, my company, Rick Inc., is just getting going. Do I want to become more like Aaron Enterprises? Well, of course I do. I want to become bigger like they are. I want to be profitable like they are. I want to be well managed like they are. And if I convince myself that I can get to the same point that Martin has gotten to with his company, maybe I can have an aspirational multiple. I know my company right now maybe is only warrants a 9.28 times multiple, but I know that Martin's company, because of the information I have on it, maybe it warrants an 11 times multiple. So I can think about that aspirational multiple value. So I can use history, I can use comparable values for the whole marketplace, or maybe I can use an aspirational target. And those would be the three most common ways that I would come up with or think about what multiple, what number I would use. But talking about it in this form masks a problem. Any idea what that problem is? Well, I can help you. You've seen this. In fact, this is on my my poster. It's on one of the quick sheets. This is the multiples quick sheet I just sent you. This is an abbreviated form of one of the tables on that multiples quick sheet where I give you just 4 of the multiples and I give you an equational form for them. We'll just focus here on the EV/EBITDA, or rather EV/EBIT multiple. And EV/EBIT is the same thing as ROIC minus G divided by ROIC times WACC minus G times 1 minus T. Now, I'm going to give you a challenge, and that is to try to figure out between now and Wednesday how this EV divided by EBIT could possibly be equal to this. I promise you that they are, and I'll give you a hint. Remember the 2 times I told you in which you would use the KVD form of free cash flow? One is when I tell you to with the KVD model, right? And the other is when we get to talk about valuation multiples. So think about this for a moment. Could we argue that if a company is expected to have a constant rate of growth, that a way of thinking about that company's value with the Gordon growth construction would simply be the value is equal to no plat times 1 minus G divided by ROIC. We know that that's free cash flow, right? So no plat times 1 minus G divided by ROIC. And then take all of that and divide it by WACC minus G. In fact, you've done that in one of the problem sets. I think it was the first problem set that you worked on. Maybe it was the second one. You've done that. Well, these inputs are the same inputs that we find in the KVD form of free cash flow, aren't they? So if you think about this as enterprise value, not EV/EBIT, but enterprise value being equal to no plat times 1 minus G divided by ROIC, and all of that divided by WACC minus G. And by the way, I can help you visualize that. I sent it to you today. It's in the valuation model structures, and we can go down and look at continuing value using the KVD structure. And I'm going to suggest to you that if we took and divided this equation on the right-hand side by EBIT, what it leaves us is that equation I just showed you. Because no plat is equal to what? What's no plat equal? You know this.
EBIT 1 minus T.
EBIT times 1 minus the tax rate. So if you substitute for no plat, EBIT times 1 minus the tax rate, you can now take and divide both sides of the equation by EBIT, can't you? And then you can do some rearranging if you'd like, so that you end up with this equational form. The reason I like this equational form is that it lets us very effectively, not quite sure what happened there. It lets us very effectively see the effect of ROIC, WACC, and G on this multiple itself. It also might let us estimate what the company's multiple could or should be. So that's a fourth way of doing this. We can look at history. We can look at other comparable firms. We can have an aspirational target, or we can actually calculate it algebraically. I always know we're going just a little far because Martin starts to rub the temples on his head and is trying to get rid of the stress lines that are going on there, so he keeps a beautiful, beautiful appearance, right? Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
I knew this. I knew this. Okay, so just like everything else, we're going to see this more than once. Let's actually look at some numbers on this thing. So for the Mira-Dravana example, if I take the company's enterprise value, and this would be the enterprise value as in its base year, divided by its EBIT for the base year, I get this multiple of 9.28. Well, how can I use this as a valuation multiple, or model rather? Well, if I'm going to believe that multiple, I can then take that multiple and times it by the next year's enterprise, or next year's EBIT. So in this case, the multiple, times 34.169, which is this EBIT from the base year, simply advanced to whatever our growth is. And it comes up with a value of 317.088. I asked you a moment ago, what possible problems could this use of such a simple valuation model give us? Recognizing that the multiple is constructed with these values, these variables. What if I'm not using this right G? Isn't it true that G is a sensitive variable in this equation? Well, of course it is. It's on the right-hand side of the equation. Okay? So if we change G, it changes the number, right? Which is why many people would tell you that a valuation multiple, more than anything else, tells you something about the expected growth of the company. Because, excuse me, I'm not quite sure how I did that. Because ROIC should be known, WACC should be known, and the tax rate should be known, right? Well, the only one we're guessing at here is G. But if we take a multiple from a particular period, point in time, and in this case call it 9.28, if we know that the left-hand side is 9.28, we know the right-hand side, ROIC and WACC and tax rates are 17 something, 16.95 and 0.26, we can now, if we wanted to, we could solve for G, couldn't we? And if we did, the G that we would be solving for would be reflective of the period of time for which this multiple was observed, not that 2, 2.5, or 3% G. So why is this a very broad-based, possibly problematic way of estimating a value? Because it applies a very broad brushstroke without a lot of operational detail and has huge room for error. If nothing else, we're applying one rate of growth to the entirety of the company's future. And we already know that that creates difficulty. Victor?
Yeah, so for instance, a situation like this where we're now globally, it's sort of impossible to evaluate the rate of growth for a company, but as we're seeing right now is that we can see that companies are getting bankrupt, but for us it's hard to evaluate in these calculations. How would you sort of to work around it then when you would start to calculate these kind of things again with the rate of the growth? That how can we, for instance, in the point we're now, we're looking at the firm and let's say that we can have cash flows for the next 2 months. And so I'm just trying to sort of understand how we can take that adjustment and make the best out of it.
Okay. So I think what you're asking me, and correct me if I'm wrong, is when we have periods of time that are so uncertain and unstable, like the one we have right now, how can you effectively use this kind of a tool to apply a value in the market? Is that what you're asking me?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So what's happening in the stock market today? Do any of you know?
In check.
Last I looked, we were off like 376. I don't want to look again because I almost vomited when I looked then. And we're down from 27 something to 18,000 something. And this is not a happy day in the Haskell household, probably not in yours either, right? Why are these numbers off so terribly? Why are the market values so, why have they fallen so dramatically from where they were? Because anybody is trying to estimate a value doesn't know what growth rate to use. Uncertainty has caused this problem, and it's exactly what you're addressing, Victor. We don't know what growth rate to assign at the moment because it is so uncertain. So we're assigning very conservative growth rates, or maybe growth rates representing the worst cases that are giving us these terrible market values, and then people are willing to pay less and less and less. So what we're experiencing today and over the last couple of weeks is a great example of what you're talking about, which means if you're going to try to value something using uncertain growth numbers, it's going to be problematic. So personally, I would never try to estimate the value of a company by simply applying a valuation multiple to it. You saw early in the semester when I had you look at the Demoterin video, he talks about valuing versus pricing, right? He talks about venture capital companies pricing. Venture capital firms always price based on multiples. They always price based on very simple multiples. We're talking about valuing and not pricing. And when we price, we're looking at comparables, and it gets to be much too broad a brushstroke. But there is a way we can look at this that brings it a little bit more closely into focus. I don't want to do that today because that goes into another model form, which you'll understand very quickly because you'll have seen this. But I want to put that discussion until Wednesday, okay? Because I can tell by some of it on your faces, we've gone about as far as most of our cerebral cortex is going to allow us to go today. What questions would you have about what we've done so far and how we're applying this?
So can you go back to the screen, the equational forms screen? So a few questions. For the EBITDA, is D, what is D? Is D depreciation or?
D is depreciation.
Okay. So 1 minus D, would that be like the percent of D? Because if not, that'll give you just a hugely negative number, obviously.
Two things. A, the only one of these I'm going to hold you accountable to is EV/EBIT. Partially because it's the easiest to calculate, okay? But it's also the one that I prefer. If you'd like to understand the algebraic construction of EV/EBITDA, I'll have you go back and think about how we might set up the right-hand side of the equation to find EBITDA in it, knowing that we would then have to multiply both sides of the equation by EBITDA in order to get the multiple construction to work out appropriately. So I don't want to go too far there. If you want to have another conversation about this without everybody else having to be subject to it, unless anybody's curious, I'm happy to do that, but I just don't want to make you go too far out there today. Okay. Any other questions you might have about the use of this? I want to go back to my estimation. 317. When I applied that 9.28 times EBIT multiple to this company's EBIT, I come up with 317. Well, what number was I coming up with when I was using free cash flow model? I think I was coming up with 149, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that is a big, big difference between 149 and 317. If I go over here where I've placed a multiple, if I put 9.28 here, well, excuse me, I put 9.28 here, it doesn't give me 317 because I'm using an elongated form of this. So that's not a good way of showing it to you. I apologize. But if this value was coming up with just the multiple itself is 317 versus the value coming up with a more rigorous approach to this, where we estimated our cash flows. And we used then the present value of those estimated free cash flows and then added them to a continuing value. If that gave us this 149, and that was based on some assumed growth rate, then using that 9.28 multiple that led us to the 317 value must be using a growth rate that's far greater than the growth rate that we're using to come up with this 149. In fact, I think the growth rate that was employed here was more like 0.18. And when I use it, Well, now I've got a problem because growth is greater than the discount rate. So there are both problems with using this multiple form, and there are virtues. The problem is that it is a broad brushstroke. The problem is it's a very simplistic way of looking at something, and we may have left many very rich variables off the table. The benefit is it's the only model form in which we can eliminate the issue of having the discount rate be smaller than the growth rate. In any of these others, our continuing value is dependent upon the discount rate and the growth rate, right? And when the discount rate is smaller than the growth rate, we get negative values. The only model form that's not going to do that is the multiple form. So it has some problems structurally, and it has some virtue structurally. And it's very, very simple. In our next class, I'll show you how to combine the two constructions so that you can use the multiple form for the continuation period and not for the explicit. And that then gives us a credible value. But we'll work on that on Wednesday.